Are you all here for the details and history of Python? Okay, good. Well, then you're sort of in the right place. Thank you all for being here at the panel on politics and ethics in programming. I am hoping this will be a really interactive, fun, challenging, thrilling panel. We could probably have an unconference on all the content that we can cover, but our panelists have assured me that they are going to give crisp, responsive answers because they want to answer as many of your questions as possible. So let me just do a brief intro. First, we have Vince here. He's got an extremely important job. He's running around with the mic. So if you guys have a question, want to make a statement, well, actually, no. If you have a question, you're going to raise your hand. He will run and find you, and we will keep this going as quickly as we can. Okay, we have 4 very talented panelists. Many of you know them in different ways. First, we have Anwesha Da, big wave. She's an advocate practicing law for over 7 years. She's an organizer of PyLadies Pune. She helps FOSS developers with legal aspects of the software industry. Okay, next we have David Miller. Wave high. You can applaud too, or applaud at the end. His bio is one of the most comical ones that I've seen, and actually it's great. It says, human, frequently fascinated, digital health with Open Healthcare UK and friends. So get your healthcare questions flowing and thinking. Okay, next we have Ira, who is passionate about products and using tech to make things better, which I can certainly get behind. Open data is a specialty of hers, and she's the founder of decentralize.org. And then you have Daniela, who probably needs no introduction after yesterday's talk about when free is too expensive, a Django core team member and member of the Django Software Foundation. First question, we'll start with a really easy one, and this was submitted by the audience, actually. And the first question is, should Twitter ban Donald Trump? And we'll start with Anwesha.
Okay. The legal answer would be, it depends. But my answer, no. Why? Because everyone has a right to free speech, but the right to free speech comes with its own limitations and restrictions. So Mr. Noble Trump should not exceed that. Maybe he should keep in mind. That would be nice.
How about Daniela?
I think Twitter could start by banning a lot more than Mr. Donald Trump, frankly, and that the kind of things that are allowed to be published on Twitter are pretty horrifying. And I think that there's no more right of free speech associated with Twitter than there is in having your opinions or advertisements placed on the side of a bus or a building. So, by all means, Donald Trump may enjoy free speech, but I don't see why he should enjoy a free platform to... actually, the question wasn't about Donald Trump's opinions. It was about him being banned from Twitter, possibly because he's dangerous rather than because of the opinions he's expressing, which is a slightly different question. So, I mean, I think that there are a lot of opinions that should not be expressed on
public platform, maybe.
On any public platform, yeah.
So it is upon the user. He should keep in mind that, should respect that.
Yeah.
Isn't there an argument for sort of transparency? You know, there's something about having access to what Donald Trump is thinking or half thinking or attempting to think that is kind of like almost slightly reassuring to have in public record so that perhaps he can be potentially questioned or held to account on it, even though that has not always been successful.
David, do you have any thoughts?
So, banning, the direct answer to the question is no, I don't think it should be banned. I think it's very important we can all know what the President of the United States has to say. I think that's a sensible thing. The question I think is slightly more interesting is, so when you look at something like Twitter, what it does is it takes pre-existing privilege that exists within society and then amplifies it and moves it into the digital online world. And the reason Trump is so successful is because people in ways which society has molded us to have power and have privilege go into this online space, and we have just repeated those sets of structures within society. And the question which is, to me, more interesting is, what more could Twitter be doing to flatten those pre-existing aspects of privilege, and is that a moral responsibility of theirs? And would that actually have a better effect in the way that we have conversations about something that someone like Donald Trump is saying, which is important? And my answer to that question would be yes. But doing it is hard and complicated and requires thinking about this right the way through, the process of making something like Twitter.
Excellent. Okay, so as much as I would like to say that we should ban him from Twitter, maybe we can revisit that at another election time. Okay, so when we're looking at issues about ethics and politics and development, we can look at it across three different disciplines, if you will. As an individual, what can we do? As a community, such as a community of Pythonistas, what can we do? And then the larger, what can government and society do? And since we started with the society question, I'm going to go back to the individual now and say, what moral obligations does a developer have in the collection and protection of personal data? And I'm going to start with Ira.
Sure. I think increasingly digital technology obviously has a huge influence on everybody's lives, on society, and one of the more successful business models that have won out is sort of advertisement-based, which really runs on personal data. It's, advertisement is successful when it's tailored, when it kind of gets people to react and often emotionally and click on adverts that might make them feel part of a group, that might make them feel better for buying a thing. When we're kind of designing software where we're asking for people's information and saying, oh, we need this information to provide Facebook, often a lot of the powers that consumers are giving away aren't really explicit. So one of the things that I think is really important is stuff like terms and conditions, which are obviously impenetrable, but the more there's a whole group of more ethical products that exist which say, actually, we're only going to take this information that's necessary for the service, and we will explicitly tell you what we're not going to do with your data. We're not going to sell it to third parties, we're not going to do this. So I think that's really important. Telling people what you're not going to do is just as important as asking permission for what you can do. There's also a GDPR big thing coming around sort of privacy and what data products can collect about it. Maybe the lawyer should talk about that.
So a lawyer get bold by this moral thing because it depends upon each individual's moral right and moral obligations, which is completely different from legal aspect. And data protection is something very close to my heart because the country I am coming from, the government is after our personal data all the time because we have this policy or we have this thing going on which is UID. We have to give our biometrics to a government, and the government is basically outsourcing it to private companies, which is not safe, and the people are actually dying out of it. So like she said now, that what the thing should be that what what are you not going to do with our data is more important than asking for something from me, from any individual.
Yeah, and with GDPR, there's sort of now kind of, you need to get explicit consent for things and what you're going to do. But it's also like, I guess part of the question is who's on the hook, right, for when things go wrong. I don't know if like you guys have heard of the Volkswagen thing where they obviously lied about their emissions, and it was the developer who's gone to jail, right? Not the sort of the company and not the boss who decided that was what needs to be built. And so one idea that I've heard kind of bandied around by some people is, should there be a union for programmers, for developers, for software engineers to sort of join so that they can kind of push back and say, actually, you know, like it's really important that we're not put in positions where we do things that are against the law or that we do things that we think are unethical. And that's something that doesn't really exist. And should it be a union? Should it be something else? But some kind of thing that exists. Another friend of mine wrote a long post about, could we have a sort of Hippocratic oath for programming? Like, should it, you know, technology matters and data breaches affect people's lives and people die. I mean, this is not kind of just sort of small stuff. And should there be an oath? Should there be regulation? I think there's a lot of kind of potential questions.
I'm going to follow up a little bit on that, because healthcare and our own personal health is something that I think is important to all of us. I want the audience to maybe think about some questions that they might have. Does anybody have a question right now about healthcare and information about you that you would like to ask the panel? Think about it. Vince will run around, I promise you. And Daniela?
In the meantime, I'm very suspicious of questions like this that ask, what are the duties of the programmer, the developer, to do this? Because a developer is very rarely working on their own and responsible for themselves. They, as you say, they are an individual usually working on behalf of a much bigger and more powerful thing than themselves. And in such a position, it's very easily to get pushed across what's already a blurred line. Whereas journalists, for example, they have industry bodies, they have codes of conduct. Whether they always observe them or not, is a different question. But there are such things as journalistic ethics, and if you're a journalist and are worried that you're being asked to do something that breaches an important code of ethics, you have people and colleagues to whom you can talk about it. Whereas programmers, who are often quite solitary by nature anyway, don't have that kind of backup to begin with. So I don't like the way the question's framed around the responsibility of the individual here.
I mean, it's not a thing that comes up necessarily in programming education, whether it be on the job or in computer science. It's not been classically thought of as something that should be taught necessarily. When you look at the moral obligation and how it might be different to something, so journalism is a really interesting thing to look at because there are codes of practice. One of the things that's different about what you are probably doing as a software developer is that the power that you have over other people is quite different. The power that you have as a journalist to affect other people is you say a thing and you might change their reputation, you might change other people's understanding of some things, and that is, of course, very powerful. But as a software developer in 2017, you are limiting the range of choices of other people. You are affecting their ability to make autonomous decisions. And the button that you put in, as opposed to the 20 buttons that you don't put in, has a different class of power over what the rest of the world can do when they are consuming your product or service. And to my mind, there is a moral obligation on people to be aware of the position of power that they are in over other people, typically other people. And of course, there are very few people who have complete autonomy to make those kinds of decisions practically, and it's a negotiation. Like if there's a moral obligation, it may well be to think about it, to talk about it, to make these choices actively, more than necessarily to be trying to say that every programmer should be able to riot and like flounce out because they think that this button is wrong. But like, you should be thinking about it, and as a team, as a group, having those conversations and having that in the process of making the thing and considering so being able to try and unpick a little bit of what are the sets of moral, philosophical, political judgments that I'm making which are informing our choices. This is why having multidisciplinary teams, which aren't just developers, are really good, because you get other people from other perspectives. And it enables you to have a slightly more sophisticated conversation with where you can spot how blind you are to these things, which is super hard.
And I think there's something that kind of happens in more technical communities where there's this focus on, well, what can we do? What's possible? And let's explore that, as opposed to, but what are the implications of that power? I completely agree that everyone needs to be involved. Like, I think product people, user researchers, anyone working in digital technology needs to have a think about, well, what are we designing, and then how could it go wrong? Like, what are the kind of, what's the failure modes? What's the risk profile? How can this infrastructure be misused? What's the implication of having all this data centralized? How secure is it? I mean, I think security is a thing that is kind of getting a much bigger profile now, but it's not sort of fundamental. You don't have to be a cryptographer to be allowed to be a programmer, right? But most products will collect some form of personal data often to provide their service, even if it is just sort of like a name, email, whatever. And I think that there's something missing in that connects those things in the conversation and the culture that exists. And I think actually having greater awareness of, how can this be misused? What could go wrong? And actually, how can we design that out? How can we actually make infrastructural design decisions that essentially make those kind of risks a lot smaller or impossible? Decentralization, for example, is a good example.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up on what all of you were saying and kind of zero in a little bit on what Daniela was saying about not just the individual, but how as a government or a business, you have cases like Uber that have breached people's use of personal data to follow them to parties or whatnot. And how do you enforce good behavior by companies that have multiple different motivations, profit being one of them, and maybe entitlement being another? I'm going to start with you.
I think the way you do that is by having governments that are prepared to stand up to large corporations and, for example, to begin by collecting taxes from them, which they don't seem to be able to do properly. So, how about growing a backbone would be a good start, I think.
Would there be specific things that you would think would be helpful for government to implement?
Laws.
Laws, okay.
Laws.
Any particular laws? You could say, I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, no, the thing is that I'm terribly fond of saying exactly what I think people ought to be doing, which is probably why I try and rein that in. I can't imagine that it's beyond the intelligence of legislators who want to achieve certain ends to set up the legal structures that make that possible. And not be so blinded and supine when it comes to, especially new technology companies, that they are literally unable to act, even to collect basic things like taxes.
Okay. And Washa, ideas, thoughts?
So, as we just discussing that these are the things that government should do, and I absolutely agree with you that the legislators, they should be educated. But I guess the movement starts from here. So if each one of you who understands technology, and if you can educate one person that if you are providing this email ID to this service for this product, which is for getting 20% off or getting €5 or €5 off, sorry, here. For this is causing a very huge harm for you. So if we can educate people, that will be good for a greater future, maybe. So, is it
Okay.
something?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, so I have been working in government and with the UK government, other governments, and like I think regulation is really important in this space, as Daniela said, but regulation is really hard, and often regulators don't know what to do, and then you end up with the cookie law, and it's a bit of a mess. So I think there is a space to show good practice working in existing communities and existing products and technologies. Personally, if I was to like sit there and venture and have an opinion, I think like having some requirements around security when you're holding personal data written in saying like you have to meet some basic standard, maybe encouraging companies to use open protocols and starting to kind of dismantle the massive monopolies that really control our at least internet social life would also be beneficial. But I think it's really hard to see some of the consequences of regulation and where regulation can have the biggest impact. So I think there is actually an opportunity for the technical community to see what works, to practice with this, to talk about it, to discuss it, to actually have really concrete, specific asks and recommendations of what regulation is important, because it's like, I don't think it's an easy answer, and I think, like people who especially aren't technical aren't just going to come up with the right way to do it by themselves.
Great. Looks like we have an audience question. Yay!
So it's not like a question, it's more like I wanted to share some experience because I'm working in a technical project, and when you say that from the perspective of a programmer, we should also get involved in this kind of issues and talk about it, like we do. And a lot of times I hear me or my colleagues saying like, hey, we need to focus on the security more. And you know, because of the time issue and because of the way that projects work right now, it's not a priority. So mostly for, you know, the product owners or the managers, when you talk about those issues, you basically get a wall and they're saying like, yeah, if we have time for this. And you can talk about it, but you don't have a strong, you know, like you said, laws or something that you can actually talk about and get some information about it. Or I don't know about it also. I'm not like educated enough to know that, hey, we need to stick to it because the law says so, for example. So the problem for me when I want to have some security issue or talk about it, or actually it's time, first of all, we don't have time for it. And second of all, it's not our priority right now. So that's the problem that we are having.
So how do we shift the burden from the individual programmer to maybe the managers of the programmers, or, you know, management in general? Or should we?
So the suggestion of, as a group of people who care about that kind of thing, educating members of the public to care about that is one way to approach creating a system where the incentives change. Because if people nobody cares about privacy, 12 people care about privacy, but like nobody really cares about privacy, people don't care about the security of their things, they don't understand it. If there was a consumer demand for it to be provably more, then your product manager would not have a choice but to prioritize that. So that's one like practical step. Regulation is really hard, and quite slow. Like regulatory time compared to technology time is like, it's a different like time scale, and the unintended consequences of regulation are really complicated. It's really easy to want a law that made it better, but I'm yet to have anyone tell me give me good examples of what laws would make that better, and how would we enforce them. It gets really hard really quickly.
Daniela has.
Sorry, I confess to being a little bit impatient with this, because we give so much margin to these large companies and repeat after them saying things, oh, it's very difficult. So we have companies like, I think it's Tesla, and you know, these companies, they're doing things like building self-driving cars and tunnels that will go from San Francisco to Los Angeles and so on. But it's too complicated for them to do things like give a breakdown of male and female pay ratios in their company, or deal with harassment. And we accept every time that these things are difficult. If aircraft fell out of the sky, you'd certainly find people being prosecuted. Nobody would be saying this is too difficult. And I can assure you that a 747 is quite a complicated piece of machinery. If companies are producing cars with doctored software, we don't need to ask about how we're going to implement the regulation. We have laws about fraud, and because we already have already have laws about emissions and so on, and we know that people are doing things wrong, but we lack the political will or guts to do anything about these companies, because our governments and perhaps our culture are afraid of them, which is why we allow companies of this kind to get away with the things that they're doing. So I'm not happy with this answer about regulation is really difficult. There are laws already. Taxes, for example, we managed to tax, you know, you all pay your taxes, and you can bet your bottom dollar they'll come after you if you fiddle a few pounds on your tax return. But if you do it in the order of billions, because you're a large technology company, you'll have an easier ride.
I think you raised a really good point. You know, I've been in tech for almost 40 years now, and to think that Google or some of these companies that are doing deep learning algorithms and whatnot, and they can't count how many employees they have in different categories, seems disingenuous. And, you know, it's nice to see that there's more folks calling folks out, but is there something as a group or like the Python community that we could be doing to put pressure on those companies to be more ethical and with the information? Anwesha, you have any ideas?
What should be Pythonistas can do? Maybe as a community, what we can do is that we need to understand the pressure. We need to educate, again education, educate the community that now the power is not in the hands of the government. Whenever we are saying something to the companies that please do this, they are like making this sweet face, and it is the government's they are not willing to do it. And it is not the case. It is like only few companies who are actually governing the whole world in a way. So if we as a community can pressurize them to, like, you have to do this, unless we as a community won't like cooperate with you. But
Any
that
more
is
thoughts
a very big idea maybe.
From the other panelists? If not, I know we have an audience question.
So just on that specifically, and I mean, and I agree, like, it's ridiculous, and obviously, plus we also have existing laws that aren't actually held, you know, don't hold companies to account, and often the consequences aren't high enough, and, you know, are just sort of built in because it's just small fines. People aren't, you know, going to jail, getting real consequences. So maybe that's like a first step, which is to really push for that. But if, you know, you carry your questions about communities. So I think part of the problem is around power. So we have this real imbalance of power. We have companies that are supranational companies that have more money than most countries, that control such a huge amount of infrastructure that people use day to day, a huge amount of data, huge amount of information. These need to really stop existing. I think monopolies are really bad for society in general, because the conversation that happens between these companies and government are not balanced. And part of the point of re-decentralize, which hasn't got much love, but maybe we'll do a conference, is to try and actually figure out ways to decentralize, to have kind of alternatives, to have an ecosystem of small, loosely joined things that work together using open standards instead of monolith organizations that basically dictate the terms with which they operate in the world. They dictate the terms that consumers consume their product. They dictate the terms when it comes to paying taxes and following laws.
David, do you have anything else to add, or should we move on to the next question? And I'm going to keep that open standards, open protocol. We've got a question right here, and then we've got a bunch of questions, one in the back and two over there.
So this is kind of continuing the discussion about power. And I mean, we talk about these companies, but actually it's not these companies, it's us. Programmers are accumulating power today. We're the ones who are slowly building a power base as developers. It's the technology that's driving the accumulation of power. So how do we, as developers, as a developer community, distribute that power so we don't start doing that centralization? So what's our job in that power equation?
Thank you.
Teach more people to have that power. This community in particular does that very well. Make things which distribute the power differently. Like this room, so it's nice to have a plug for something like really centralized. This room in particular, there's a list of technologies which distribute power differently that you can use. And even if all you do is investigate them, think about them, and understand that there are alternative ways to do things, and realize that the thing you're doing is a choice, that's a good first step. And this room is probably also a relatively rich room with good career prospects. You can make financial decisions. Like it is more likely than a random group of the population with this size that you can make decisions which enforce your belief about how these things should be structured when you're using technologies, and vote with your wallet and feet. And you are also a group which is likely to be able to make informed decisions in that way, in a way that people in the street might not be able to. Those are three.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say building in transparency is really important. So kind of transparency of how things work, the powers, the decisions that get made. So there's like a lot of work going into algorithmic decision-making transparency, and whether there are appeal processes. So sometimes, hey, we've got AI, we've got machine learning, we can just like decide that you're bad and you shouldn't get a bank account, or your insurance should be really high, and there's not, and often that's not fair, and some of the decision makers don't realize how buggy software can be as well, which I talk about too much, so I'm not going to do that now. But transparency, openness, like things like open data in terms of, not for personal data, but in terms of other data that people collect that allow people to have more informed understanding of what's happening, allows sort of civic tech organizations to hold organizations to account. I think decentralized infrastructure. So I was working on a project around kind of cross-government infrastructure for querying personal data, and everyone was like, oh, we just need this central hub that everything goes through. And I was like, oh my God, no. Like, Jesus Christ, people, everyone who says that, you're literally, you just haven't thought about it. But one of the things that we did was we spent a lot of time trying to think of a really decentralized architecture where, it's really data minimal, you don't move data around, you kind of access it at source, you access really, ask really specific questions instead of general questions that enable the service outcome, the decision to be made, and not just like, let's just collect and copy data because we can. And it's been really tough to actually get that project really understood and accepted. Sort of like, why do you need this, decentralized nodes? Why do you need sort of this custom protocol? Why is it a bit like a blockchain? Not that blockchains are good, guys, just, but you know, after like a few months of being like, oh, here are the important, you know, privacy, security features that exist, and look, you can actually be compliant to GDPR, and, you know, with general data protection regulation, fines go up to 20 million minimum for data breaches, so companies really need to start thinking about that. It's actually been really welcomed. Like, it took a lot of effort and a lot of time and a lot of presentations, but actually starting to think about, yeah, transparency, decentralization, proper security, and there's a lot of good practice that exists. There's a lot of really great examples where that works, would be, yeah, the suggestions I have.
Cool. We're about 2/3 of the way through at this point. So what we're going to kind of do is, I know we've got some questions queued up in the audience. We're going to try and do like the lightning speed round of, you know, whoever feels that they want to jump in, jump in. Vince, first question.
Well, I'm sorry because I'm going back a little in
That's
the
fine.
topic. I think this is related about the problem of shifting concerns and who has the guilt within the company.
Right.
I think we should take a step back and consider the consumer. We as a consumer are spoiled. We want the new next shiny thing. And that makes companies force everybody within the company to live up to their expectations. Me as a client, me as a consumer, I want the new thing. Doesn't matter how is it done, I just want it now. And I think we also should start educating as the consumers that this takes effort, and we should show people that everybody within the company needs time to actually do it and has their internal issues.
So how do we educate consumers to be thoughtful and ethical consumers, really?
You ban all advertising.
Any more thoughts? It's a good one.
Can't really follow that.
Okay. And Wesha? David?
I mean, I don't think that would work, but you could, educating people about a new thing is really hard, and it's just loads of outreach and like quiet one-on-one conversations with people very calmly where you explain stuff. It just takes forever.
Right. And Wesha?
Yes, banning advertisement, I would love to do that. I'm for that, but what David said is much practical. But because when I am trying to explain that to my grumpy dad, banning advertisement doesn't work with him. But if I try to explain him quietly that these are the things you are actually giving, whether it's a fair transaction of your data or not, if we can educate people regarding that you are giving this much and you are gaining this much, if we can do that, that would be great, I guess.
Great.
I think there's one thing which is actually, we're living in a world where, you know, you can get information so much easier, and information can spread, like, you know, you've all seen the memes of cats and other things. We just need memes about privacy and security to, you know, be proliferating the internet. And next time there's like a really awesome, brilliant new Netflix series, they should just be really like, oh man, awesome, you know, consumer rights, security and privacy are so cool.
I love that. All right, next question.
I have a question on whistleblowing. Now, as programmers, we rather routinely, and not necessarily deliberately, end up with access to information that perhaps legally we shouldn't have access to,
Right.
or perhaps we should legally have access to it, but we're finding out things that aren't part of our job description. Now, imagine that you're a programmer and you've accidentally uncovered something which is of serious public interest, and it would be career suicide to report it to your boss. And you'd potentially have done wrong in having acquired that information in the first place. What is the right action in a situation like that?
What is the right action? Because there were other questions people submitted about, like, should Edward Snowden have disclosed the information that he did? But as a programmer, in my day-to-day job, if I run across personal information or whatever, what should I do?
I mean, potentially, depending on the type of thing, you can report it to, the Independent Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, and every country has, or is supposed to have, not every country, sorry, a lot of the Western world countries, sorry, completely wrong, because I haven't spent a bunch of time looking into countries that don't have any of this, but there are independent organizations whose job it is to, look into this and prosecute this stuff.
We're going to do maybe one or two more quick questions, and then we're going to kind of wrap it up with some statements by each of our panelists.
Someone saying anything? Okay, well, yeah. Do you want to?
So, if you don't have any of such committee or organization in administration, we don't have that fair administration. So if you are committing wrong, and that's not my legal advice, if you are committing anything wrong, just do a blog post and try to reach those organizations who can actually use those things to make the world a better place. Because anyways you are committing crimes, so why not committing in a better way?
So your advice as a lawyer is, if you're committing crimes, write blog posts about it.
But
Not
anonymous
as a,
one. No.
not as
Use
a,
the opportunity of committing a crime
crime.
to also, tell people, or,
To grow
anyways you are
readership for
going
your
to
blog.
jail, why not?
tell some journalists.
Yes.
Just. Oh gosh, this is being videoed.
Just a side comment, if anyone wants to know how to leak things securely,
Yes.
come and meet me after the panel.
We have a question way in the back, actually two. One, two. I think if we're quick, we can do them both. Run, Vince, run.
Hey, hello. So I've heard the panel talk a lot about distributed data and not giving your data away to anybody and things like that. So I've got a quick questions for each panelist, and I would like to ask them what is their email provider. I'm expecting most of them to be using Google, and so if the answer for you is Google or Microsoft, you're probably doing that because it's easier for you. But so if people, the community here, is picking the easiest solution disregarding their privacy, how can we educate other people to do better?
Daniela, you want to start?
Asking me about how to educate people. This is an uphill task, and I don't think it's the kind of thing that can be accomplished by writing weblogs or creating memes or whatever. I think that this really does have to be something that to be addressed at the most fundamental level as a question in society, so that we bring our cultural thinking up to date with the challenges of the technology. And that means actually starting by thinking at it at a very serious level from the top down, not just relying on people to do it at ground level.
So when we were discussing about the community, what community can do, if we can have each of the project, so if each of the open source project, they do have their license.txt, and with that, if we can have something like code of conduct.txt or MD, where we'll be mentioning that these are the things, if you want to contribute to this project, you have to do you have to follow these code of conducts, or these, when you are writing code for this project, you have to think about these security aspects also. For that, if you can educate the developers or the contributors for that project, that will be nice.
The software I've contributed to has almost certainly been used to kill people. And if you've contributed to Python or Django, then you too have contributed to software that is probably right now being used to kill people. That's a fact. If you make a pen, if you manufacture a pen, you're manufacturing one of the most deadly devices that the world has known. I'm not sure that we can start at that point or not, or whether something else would work.
So I mean, part of the question was also about, so for example, using Google, which actually I do use. I have a dependence on Google that I'm deeply uncomfortable with, but it's there, and you know, and it comes back to what are the viable alternatives? What else can exist? And the thing is, there isn't a simple answer, right? There's like, I get asked about like, oh, what's the answer? And there isn't an answer, but it's a challenge, and it's an interesting one, and it's one that an increasing amount of smart, brilliant people are thinking about. And for my part, I think there's a bit that probably needs to be regulated. There's a bit about actually increasing people's awareness of stuff. So, for example, the Ashley Madison scandal hack started getting some people thinking about, oh my gosh, you know, what am I signing up for and what might happen to my data? Having kind of alternatives, having communities like whatever the indie web guys or the really centralized guys or other stuff helps, because these communities do grow over time. Mastodon Social, which is like a decentralized Twitter alternative, is actually really popular in some circles. And you know, and memes or cultural understanding of certain concepts and ideas and priorities also have an impact, but it's probably not a kind of, great, we'll just regulate and it'll be fine, or we'll just, you know, come up with a better open standard that will unite some other standards and everyone is going to use and it'll be amazing. It's like, that's also not, it's part of the answer, but it's not the answer. And I think that's what makes it a really interesting, exciting space.
Okay, we're going to go one last question, and then I'm going to have each panelist, after this question, talk about what call to action they have for us in the next year. Go for it.
Most programmers are working for companies. They have a contract of employment. So do they have a right or a responsibility to have ethics or political views separate from the ones of the boards of directors who are legally in charge of their world of work?
David, do you want to start us off?
I wouldn't advise you to sign a contract of employment that says you're not allowed to have different politics to your boss, but I'm not entirely sure whether or not you have a right to enforce those politics on the organization you work is unlikely. I'm not sure I necessarily follow the question, but
about that.
Rights are really complicated, right? It's a really loaded term. My personal experience has been that I have complained, and I have felt good about that when it has come up. And I prefer to do that and not do it. Rights are, it's difficult phrasing. I would definitely suggest, but again, we come back to the point about suggesting that people should then feel themselves should put their employment. Some people are not in a position where they can jeopardize their employment by doing that. It becomes a difficult question to answer in the abstract, at the high level.
Well, I mean, this is partly why earlier I talked about maybe there should be some kind of union or like an ethical code that people could at least point to, and you know, there's like this power in numbers. I think I don't know of a kind of union or ethical code that exists. I know some people who've been working on that, but I think that is one way to try and align with something greater than just your employer and to point your employer to.
Well, interesting discussion, questions. Thank you all for participating. I want to give the panelists a brief few seconds to say what their call to action is for us. And I'm going to start with Anwesha and go down the row.
It would be good if you stop using Google for now, like from now. Stop using Google, Facebook, Twitter, and there's a very nice platform called Diaspora. If we can use that. Stop giving your private information, because if you are giving your private information, with that you're attaching your family's private information, and with that friends, relatives and everyone. So if we can do that, educate people.
Thanks, Anwesha. David?
Really simply, the next time you're about to start doing something which is a feature in the thing that you work on, explicitly stop and try and think about what types of people aren't in the room and make sure you're considering the impact that it will have on the types of people who aren't making that decision. It's just...
Great. Ira?
Oh, I think we should do lots of things, but one thing would be to, maybe we should, I think I would love to see some kind of like ethical design principles. You know, what kind of steps should you think about and go through that is kind of widely seen, used, referenced, and maybe that's what we should, you know, be doing this evening, afternoon. It's getting that drafted.
Sounds like a good sprint for Monday. Daniela?
If you heard Raynola's excellent talk on Thursday morning, you'll know that Ralph Nader nearly single-handedly changed a political culture in which safety at first wasn't prioritized and later became prioritized. So if you have the wit and energy of a Ralph Nader, then you can be a political campaigner that changes something. But most of us don't, so we can do what we do when there are other political things that need to be addressed, like problems with pollution in our natural environment, and that is badger our political representatives until something in the culture changes. Because I think this is not a question for individuals, it's a political question.
Thank you. Give it up for our panelists. They did a great job. And I encourage the rest of you to take advantage of the hallway track and enjoy lunch. Have a great day.